KTLA Samantha Cortese joins us live with more on the wave of vandalism in protest of Elon Musk and his role in Washington. Sam?
Hi, Sharon, Micah. The ATF and FBI are collaborating with federal, state, and local law enforcement to investigate acts of domestic terrorism surrounding Teslas.
What happens when two of the continent's largest neighbors engage in a trade war? When billions of dollars and thousands of jobs are at stake, and relations between seemingly unshakable countries become increasingly strained. Tariffs, boycotts, protests, and even political threats. It seems that everything can lead to unpredictable consequences. Recently, Donald Trump announced 25% tariffs on cars imported into the US. And while his trade policy has been criticized many times, no one expected that this initiative would provoke a real storm in the market and in relations between the two countries.
Tesla is a peaceful company. We've never done anything harmful. I've never done anything awful. I've only done productive things. So I think we just have a deranged, there's some kind of mental illness thing going on here, because this doesn't make any sense.
Canada, it seemed, could easily get over it. However, the response was much harsher than expected. In the days after the tariffs were announced, there was a sharp drop in the number of airline bookings between the US and Canada, as much as 70%. And that's just the beginning. Canadians have begun refusing to travel to the US en masse and actively boycotting US goods. You might think this is just a petty political game, but the reality turns out to be much more complicated. Protests are taking place in major cities across the country demanding that the interests of workers and citizens be protected. These protests carry not only a political message, but also a call to defend the sovereignty that is now on the line. We will not be the 51st state of the United States, the protesters declare. This statement is not just words. It is a signal to the world. Canada is ready to fight for its interests, even if it has to make economic sacrifices. But that's not all. Canada's expected response has become even more forceful. A plan is already in place that includes not only political measures but also economic support. A $2 billion strategic fund aimed at supporting Canadian workers and protecting domestic industry is emerging as a response to US actions. The Canadian government says it will not allow thousands of jobs to be destroyed, especially in the auto industry, which is the backbone of the country's economy. But there are other questions looming. How seriously is Canada prepared to fight for its interests? What economic consequences await the US if the Canadian economy starts looking up?
Teslas are being torched across the country. Dealerships shot up and set on fire. Spray paint to vandalize and make a statement. People in Southern California are getting notes on their Teslas, calling them complicit Nazis for owning electric cars.
But what will happen next? In response to Trump's actions, Canada is imposing counter-tariffs to the tune of $30 billion. And here's where it gets interesting. This is just the beginning. It's been a long time since global politics and economics have seen such tense moments. How will events unfold next? Will Canada, which has severed trade ties with the US, be able to establish its own economy and become more independent? And what will become of the US economy if this trade conflict continues? How great are the chances that these countries will even find a compromise? These questions remain unanswered, and we are on the cusp of one of the most dramatic periods in the history of North American relations. Don't miss your chance to learn the full details of this important conflict. When Donald Trump announced the imposition of 25% tariffs on cars imported into the United States, few realized the effect this measure would have on the economies of the two largest neighbors on the continent. He attributed his decision to the need to protect American jobs and maintain the competitiveness of the national industry. However, this initiative turned out to be not just a political move, but the beginning of a serious economic conflict that could turn into a real trade war between the US and Canada. The Canadian leadership perceived this as a direct threat and began to prepare retaliatory measures.
We've accomplished more in 43 days than most administrations accomplished in 4 years or 8 years, and we are just getting started.
He praised all the domestic actions he has taken so far on immigration.
And I deployed the U.S. military and Border Patrol to repel the invasion of our country.
And spending cuts.
We are draining the swamp It's very simple.
Immediately after the announcement of the tariffs, relations between the neighboring countries deteriorated significantly. Economists predicted that such measures could exacerbate not only economic, but also political differences. The US and Canada have long held interdependent positions in the global market, especially in industries such as automobiles, agriculture, and energy. The imposition of tariffs on automobiles was a blow, not only to Canada, but also to the production chains that link the three countries, Canada, the US, and Mexico. Under these circumstances, the market consequences became inevitable. Canadian businesses faced huge challenges as more than 75% of auto parts produced in Canada were exported to the US. Now, with the tariffs going up, they risked losing that revenue, which in turn jeopardized tens of thousands of jobs. So what happened in response to this move? Canada began an active campaign to boycott American goods and services. Citizens began refusing to travel to the US en masse, which led to a sharp decline in airline bookings. Already in the first month after the introduction of tariffs, the number of flights between the two countries dropped by 70%. Canada, previously closely tied to America in terms of tourists and business travel, now faced an unprecedented reaction. Airlines began canceling flights, and those Canadians who had previously preferred to vacation or work in the US were now turning their attention to more localized and affordable destinations within the country. Faced with this situation, Canadian authorities decided not to sit idly by and began to develop strategic measures to protect their economy.
We begin with the president's trade war escalating tonight. This evening, the retaliation against the United States, Canada, and the European Union responding quickly, just hours after President Trump's 25% tariff on all steel and aluminum coming into the United States.
In response to the US, Canada decided to start fighting to save jobs and protect its economy. This was not just lip service. Canada announced the creation of a $2 billion strategic fund that was to be the first line of defense against the economic consequences of the tariff war. This fund was aimed at developing and supporting domestic manufacturing, including the automotive industry. The Canadian government also announced the introduction of a program under which businesses could defer taxes as well as receive financial support in the form of large loan packages. In response to the US threats, Canada said it was ready to impose counter-tariffs on US goods worth about $30 billion. Thus, a real economic war began, and now both countries were preparing to fight not only for money, but also for political stability. From that moment on, the situation between the two countries became more and more tense. Canadian workers who were left without jobs due to the closure of factories began to receive tangible support. The authorities insisted that all aid should be directed not only at protecting workers, but also at developing new industries that could strengthen Canada's economy in the long run. Despite all efforts, however, the destruction of established economic ties was inevitable. Forecasts suggested that the disruption of production chains and the redistribution of the flow of goods could not help but affect both economies. The Canadian authorities sought to minimize losses, but the question remained, what consequences would the US economy suffer? American entrepreneurs began to feel the first blows from Trump's new trade policy. Increased shipments became significantly more expensive, causing prices to rise in industries such as automotive, technology, and even food. Small and medium-sized businesses have struggled, and due to rising production costs, many US companies have begun laying off employees, adding tension to the political situation in the country. But more importantly, the increase in tariffs on automobiles directly affected large corporations such as General Motors and Ford, whose production chains were closely linked to Canada. This led to a crisis in the labor market and increased social tensions within the country.
Canada, the largest supplier of steel to the U.S., slapping new tariffs on $20 billion worth of U.S. goods that are sold in Canada. And the 27 countries of the European Union imposing retaliatory tariffs on up to $28 billion worth of U.S. goods sold in Europe, including Harley-Davidson motorcycles and Kentucky bourbon. President Trump with the Irish Prime Minister visiting the White House today. The president suggesting his tariffs won't stop here, saying, "Of course, I'm going to respond." And tonight, right here, the new poll showing 56% of Americans disapprove of President Trump's handling of the economy. The number's even worse now on the president's tariffs.
Canada, despite its determination and strong economic measures, could not help but feel the economic consequences of its steps in response. The breakdown in trade relations meant that the country was not only struggling to save jobs, but also had to create new economic ties and opportunities. How successful these measures might be remains to be seen. However, the conflict with the US itself has already led to a growing national consciousness, and the issue is not only economic, but also questions of political independence. In parallel, the government undertook a number of initiatives to encourage domestic production. Canadian economists, including the renowned financial analyst Julien Leblanc, put forward the view that the growth of domestic tourism could be not only a temporary reaction to an external threat, but also a sustainable trend that would later bring significant benefits to the country's economy. The entrepreneurs, which included major players in the food and consumer goods distribution market, noticed that consumers were seeing a growing interest in products made directly in Canada. This even led to the creation of new brands that were beginning to be active in the consumer market.
Tesla shares have slumped by more than 9% amid a fall in sales in Europe. The electric vehicle maker posted lower sales across 5 European countries, including France and the UK. Joining us now to discuss this is CBS News foreign correspondent Remy Inocencio. Remy, why do we believe these sales are dropping? What's driving that?
Sure. Well, Errol, basically what Elon Musk has been talking about over the past, say, few months, ever since Donald Trump's election back to the White House, that has been fueling this anger, this frustration. Some even say disgust towards Musk, and they're taking it out on Tesla. Tesla now feeling the pain. But because of what's happening here in Europe, Tesla sales fell by nearly half across the continent just last month, 45%.
However, the domestic economy was not the only aspect that Canada focused on in the face of harsh economic sanctions. Along with the growing support for domestic goods and services, the government began to introduce additional measures aimed at protecting Canadian jobs in industries such as automotive. One of the most striking steps was the creation of a $2 billion strategic fund. This amount was aimed at supporting workers who may have been affected by rising tariffs on automobile parts and components. The authorities also promised to create new jobs in sectors such as renewable energy and high technology. The government said this was to offset losses suffered by Canadian industry due to economic sanctions. Canada's Finance Minister Arthur McGill said in a statement at a press conference, "We're not only protecting jobs, we're protecting Canadian industry and the economy of the future. This $2 billion is our investment in the country's independence and stability." He emphasized that these measures will help create thousands of new jobs, as well as set the country's economy on a path of more diversified growth. Such measures, in turn, have greatly increased the confidence of Canadian citizens in supporting their country. Protests that were previously held in major cities have now been complemented by initiatives to support domestic manufacturing and employment. New opportunities for entrepreneurs have emerged, leading to the growth of small businesses, which have become not only an important part of the Canadian economy, but also a symbol of its resilience to external threats. In cities such as Toronto and Ottawa, environmental and technology startups began to proliferate in order to reduce dependence on US supplies and expand their own manufacturing capabilities.
Well, this feels more like a Tesla-only story when you look at just this fall in EV sales for them, that they're suffering across Europe, down 45% in January. The wider EV market in Europe up 37%, so rivals are catching up and performing.
But for the US in turn, the economy began to come under serious pressure. Already in the first months after the tariffs were imposed, there was a rise in car prices, which affected consumer spending. Car manufacturers such as Ford and Chrysler were forced to raise the prices of their products, which caused discontent among American consumers. Moreover, due to rising tariffs and supply problems from overseas, factories within the US began to face shortages of components and materials. This, in turn, led to job cuts as well as a slowdown in production. One of the most alarming signals for the US authorities was the drop in consumer confidence, which was associated with rising prices and shortages of goods, which was reflected in economic indicators. Economists warned that the ongoing trade conflict could lead to much more serious consequences for the economies of both countries, as they have long depended on each other within the single North American production space. The tariff and retaliatory tariff situation remained tense, and neither side was willing to make concessions. In the months following the imposition of tariffs, both countries continued to strengthen their positions, and economists watched anxiously to see how this war was affecting ordinary citizens. With each passing day, it became apparent that the consequences could be long-lasting, and the course that the US and Canada chose would have an impact on economic relations for decades to come.
Outperforming as well in some cases, doing better than Tesla. And you just have to think, how much more is this a sustained issue for Tesla going forward, given the fact that you have Elon Musk, who's been very forthright in his opinions, particularly weighing in on politics, particularly in Europe. We've just had the European elections, which Musk has been very focused on. But across the piece, when you look at the performance for Tesla in Europe, it's not just in small countries. There are a lot of countries where Tesla has been performing badly, including in Germany, in the UK, where it has been lagging, and Spain as well.
The situation that unfolded between the US and Canada after the imposition of tariffs on automobiles could not help but affect international relations and the economies of other countries. Canadian measures to protect its economy and jobs did not go unnoticed in the world. In response to US actions, Canada actively sought allies, and its policies were supported by many countries that were also interested in preserving free trade and protecting their economic interests. One of the first countries to support Canada was Australia, which, like Canada, had serious trade ties with the US and realized that interference in global trade relations entailed a threat to other economies. Canada's protests and actions sparked interest not only among economists but also among politicians around the world. Soon, France and Scotland also expressed solidarity with Canada by supporting its position in international forums. Meanwhile, international relations between the US and Canada continued to deteriorate. Countries that had traditionally maintained close economic ties with the US began to consider the possibility of renegotiating that relationship. Not only the Canadian economy, but also the stability of other countries was jeopardized by the deteriorating trade relationship. It was not just tariffs that were behind this, but deeper issues such as the geopolitical situation, military spending, and energy policy. Canada, which had been one of the most important partners of the US since signing NAFTA, now faced the threat of economic isolation. However, instead of retreating, the Canadian leadership decided to strengthen its position and pursue a policy of independence, defying US pressure.
That's from the European Automobile Manufacturers Association. People just choosing with their wallets to not buy Teslas because of that Musk-Trump association. And actually here in London, an activist group called Everyone Hates Elon actually have been hacking bus stop signs with posters. I actually passed one yesterday. First, I wasn't quite sure what was happening, but it said the words 0 to 1939 in 3 seconds. Illusion here, 0 to 60 in like 3 seconds or something. But this poster was alluding to the start of World War II, and the image was of Musk giving that hand salute that we saw at Trump's inauguration that many have attacked as a Nazi gesture. Musk, though, has neither admitted or denied what he was doing. But we're seeing the knock-on effect of that anti-Musk anger across Europe and in terms of sales.
But the question that remained open was how this conflict would affect Canada's own economy. Responses such as counter-tariffs and the creation of a strategic fund to support jobs could only partially relieve the pressure on the economy, but not solve all the problems. Economists predicted that, on a long-term basis, Canada would be forced to find new markets and sources of supply to avoid dependence on the United States. One of the biggest threats to Canada was the destruction of its automobile industry, which had traditionally worked for exports to the United States. The losses were significant, and many factories faced reduced production and consequently mass layoffs. Workers who were out of work began to look for new job opportunities, but the labor market was not ready to adapt quickly to such changes. At the same time, the situation in the US was becoming more and more difficult. Every day, the economic crisis worsened, as Trump's actions led to an increase in commodity prices, hampered work at the largest enterprises, and aggravated social tensions. Large corporations like Ford and General Motors were affected first, as they began cutting jobs as a result of rising production costs. Smaller businesses were also affected as tariffs on materials and components from Canada caused them to lose profits. In addition, the US faced growing problems in industries such as agriculture, where dependence on Canadian supplies was particularly high. US farmers began to lose markets, and as a result, exports to Canada declined significantly.
After Trump imposed those sweeping 25% tariffs on aluminum and steel imports, the European Union retaliating with tariffs on up to $28 billion of U.S. goods. Trump making it clear this isn't over, vowing to respond in kind with sweeping retaliatory tariffs early next month.
They're doing what they should be doing, perhaps, for the European Union, but it does create ill will. And as you know, we're going to be doing reciprocal tariffs. So whatever they charge us, we're charging them.
Canada also striking back with new tariffs on $20 billion worth of U.S. goods, mostly steel and aluminum, but also computers and sporting goods.
At this time, the attention of global economists was focused on two aspects: how far Canada was willing to go in its response, and what the U.S. response to this course of action would be. Some analysts predicted that the conflict could lead to a permanent breakdown in trade relations between the two countries, which would entail the disruption of existing trade chains, which in turn would lead to economic turmoil on the international stage. In response, Canada has developed a plan to create new trade agreements with other countries, an important step towards diversifying foreign trade. Against this backdrop, new economic alliances and support from countries in Europe, as well as certain Asian nations, emerged. The trade war between Canada and the United States reached a level where each new decision attracted the attention of the whole world. The world economy was on the verge of major changes, and it was unclear to the end how it would affect the stabilization or destruction of global economic ties. The possibility of a way out of the crisis remained uncertain. Many experts believed that further U.S. steps could provoke new economic measures from other countries, which would only intensify the consequences for the global economy. Meanwhile, the Canadian authorities continued to confidently defend their interests, believing that in the context of globalization and interdependence of economies, a trade war with the U.S. could drag on for many years. Canadians realized that this was not just a conflict over trade terms, but a struggle for their country's future in the face of new geopolitical and economic realities. However, despite growing tensions and international isolation, Canada's economic policy to date has shown that even in the most difficult situations, it is possible to find ways to adapt and grow, albeit through economic hardship and redistribution of global trade flows.